very much for inviting me to present and give a talk here in the annual meeting. It's a privilege to be a part of this program. And I will be speaking to the algorithmic aspects of a problem called firefighting, which turns out to be, I think, a pretty powerful abstraction for various events that pan out in the real world. So we're going to talk about that a little bit here. So here is an outline of how this will hopefully go. So I'm going to start off by defining the problem, and then we will talk about graph theoretic concept called separators, and we'll see how that turns out to be relevant for firefighting. And we will probably not have time to talk about trees, but that turns out to be a nice special case, and I'll probably end up skipping this part of the discussion and skip directly to talking about other variants, but I'm just have an eye on the clock, and just in case I get lucky, I just wanted to be sure that the slides are there. All right, so let's start off by talking about the firefighting game. This is a game that occurs on a graph or a network, and your mental model of a network could be something like a social network or a road network or even a water network or a human proximity network. So essentially, the objects in a network are vertices and edges. So you have these entities. For instance, let's talk about a social network because everyone's probably familiar with Facebook, etc. So you could think of the people as being the nodes or the vertices, and two people have an edge between them if they're friends with each other, right? So this is what we think of as a simple undirected graph. There's nothing fancy here. There are no waves or orientations or anything like this. And the notion of a fire is something that you can think of as information that's spreading across the network, for instance. So, for example, I think even as we speak, the Academy Twitter account has already posted an announcement of this session on their Twitter handle, right? And then people who see it may choose to share it on their Twitter accounts or their timelines, and then their friends who see it in turn, and if they find it relevant, are going to share it further. So that's how information typically spreads across a network. And if you're familiar with graph theoretic terminology, you might think of this as a so-called BFS or a breadth first spread. So that's how we think of, that's how we imagine a fire spreading through a network. And you could imagine the fire modeling either something desirable or something undesirable. So for instance, you could be thinking about the spread of an advertisement on a social network. So if you're a marketing person, you want it to spread as much as possible. You can think of it as some critical information. Again, you want it to reach as many people as possible. So that problem where you want to sort of seed your information in a network and in the hope, or you want to design it in such a way that it spreads as quickly as possible. This is typically what is referred to as the influence maximization problem in the literature, and it's very well studied. And what we are going to talk about today, on the other hand, is not influence maximization, but the opposite, where the fire is representing something undesirable. So you, for instance, continuing the context of social networks, you could think of the fire as being a rumor, fake news, misinformation. So this is something that you do not want to spread quickly. You want to curtail the spread of this kind of things as much as possible. If you're thinking of very roughly a human proximity network, you could also think of the fire as being the spread of a virus. And this is something that's been the global discourse for the last several months in terms of vaccination strategies and how do you isolate affected areas effectively. And and prior to our having a vaccine for COVID, for instance, we were thinking about lockdowns, and there were a lot of other factors. Of course, it was not just a matter of the structure of the network, but we had socioeconomic considerations. So that's you need more nuanced models for that. But at a high level, you can imagine that the spread of a fire can actually, at least in a basic sort of way, model some of these scenarios, right? So firefighting is the problem of trying to understand strategies for stopping the spread in its tracks. So we abstract this out and model it as a turn-based two-player game. So you can think of the two players as being the fire and the propagator and the protector. So the fire is propagating and the protector is trying to stop the propagation in its tracks. So I'm going to denote vertices that are on fire by orange. So you can see that, for instance, the fire has to start somewhere. And so the fire, the propagator, is the first player. And the second player, the protector, on its turn can choose to place a firefighter on any vertex that he or she desires. And once a vertex or a node has a firefighter on it, we think of it as a protected vertex. It's a vertex that cannot catch fire anymore. And as we said, the fire spreads breadth first style. So what happens when it's the propagator's turn, when it's the turn for the fire to spread, is that every vertex, which is the neighbor of a burning vertex, which is not protected, also catches fire. Okay, so if you're adjacent to something that's burning and you don't have protection, then you start burning as well whenever it's the propagator's turn. Okay, so this continues in this fashion for some time, and at some point the game ends. I mean, of course, it's a network with a finite number of vertices, so it's bound to end after at most n steps, and being the number of vertices, that point you simply run out. But as you can see here, it's actually stopped short even earlier. And the reason for that is that the fire now has nowhere to go. So every vertex that is not already burning and that's not protected is a vertex that's only adjacent to protected vertices. So all of these gray vertices that you see to the right of your screen, they're all adjacent to green vertices. So none of them are going to catch fire. So the fire is kind of stuck, and in some sense, its spread has been curtailed by deploying 3 firefighters. So a little bit of terminology at this point. As we've said, the vertices that are on fire are called burnt vertices. The vertices that have firefighters on them are protected. And the vertices that remain at the end that did not catch fire, even though they were not explicitly protected, are called saved vertices. So that's the setting of the game. Those are the rules. And at this point, you can imagine that the protector has some work to do in terms of trying to strategize about what's the best placement of firefighters and how best can he work it out to meet various natural optimization goals. So you may want to maximize the number of saved vertices, or you may want to minimize the number of burnt vertices. These sound like two sides of the same coin, and indeed they're very similar problems, but they're sort of subtle ways in which the algorithmic complexities could be different. Okay, so that's why I state them separately. Similarly, you could think of minimizing the number of firefighters that you deploy, because you could think of firefighters as being a resource that costs you. So you're working with a limited budget and you can only deploy so many firefighters. And that's roughly the same as trying to minimize the number of rounds. This is, this is a very destructive game, so you don't want it. Every round that it lasts is more damage. So you want to minimize the number of rounds. Again, these two questions sound similar, but again, there are variations where you can deploy, if you like, more than one firefighter in each round. So there could be, again, some very subtle differences between these two formulations, which is why I have them stated differently explicitly. You could also say that you have some vertices that you want to prioritize. So there are some critical vertices, and maybe if these catch fire, you have a problem, either because, so if you were thinking of it as a literal fire, these could be locations that have precious goods in them, and you don't want them to catch fire. These could be vertices that are somehow very influential. So if they catch fire, the fire immediately propagates very quickly from here. So maybe that's why you want to protect them. So whatever your reasons, you may be in a situation where you want to protect a given subset of vertices. It could be, so you can imagine that this is a different goal from just maximizing the number of saved vertices, because it's possible that every strategy that maximizes the number of saved vertices somehow ends up missing these critical vertices, because it's possible that your critical vertices are located in such a way that that they're very close to the fire, and you would somehow not watch out for them unless you were explicitly asked to. So this is the variant that we will be sort of focusing on for the rest of our discussion. So in terms of work that's known in the literature, it turns out that this problem is quite intractable in the sense of its computational complexity. So we have a theoretical framework, which we call NP completeness, which helps us identify when something is unlikely to admit efficient polynomial time algorithm. And it turns out that most variants of the firefighting problem, the algorithmic question of whether it's possible to deploy a certain number of firefighters to take care of the fire, it turns out that this question is often intractable in this sense. So I don't want to get into too many specifics here, but the point is that it's intractable even if the underlying graph network had a very simple structure. So in particular, even if it didn't have any cycles, so that's when we say that the network is a tree. And it turns out that trees are often easy to deal with because they have a lot of structure that you can exploit. But it turns out that even on trees, it's NP hard if you want to. It's hard to figure out what's the best way to save a critical set of vertices. There are some approximation algorithms which help you deploy not too many more than the optimal number of firefighters, so that's also known. And our work in this context is from a slightly different perspective than approximation. So we use a framework called parameterized complexity or parameterized algorithms to analyze the problem. So our take on this is that, okay, given the background that we are unlikely to have polynomial time algorithms for solving the problem, can we shoot for algorithms whose running time is not much worse than polynomial. So it's polynomial, and then there's a multiplicative overhead, which is some function of a parameter that we identify. This function is allowed to be exponential because we know that we cannot come up with something that's polynomial time always. But let's say that we have an algorithm whose running time is something like, let's say, 2 raised to k times some polynomial in n, where I'm implicitly using n to denote the size of the graph. And so you have this overhead of 2 to the k, which means that you basically you have a more nuanced understanding of how expensive your algorithm is. And in particular, when k is only as bad as log n, for instance, this is going to be actually polynomial time, 2 to the log n being only an linear overhead of whatever polynomial you already had. And so really it depends on choosing an appropriate parameter that would hopefully be small in practice. So we know that in the worst case, your parameters are probably going to take values that can be as bad as n, can be omega n, but hopefully you're able to choose a parameter for which you can come up with algorithms with these kinds of running times, for which it is true that, hopefully the parameters are small in practice. So just to make this discussion a little more concrete, let me just ground it with some specific examples of parameters. So for instance, maybe you only want to save a very small number of critical nodes. So that's a very natural choice of parameter, right? So that's something that's probably in many situations going to be small. You could parameterize by something called the tree width of a graph. Again, I will not have time to define this. If you know it already, that's great. But if not, feel free to ignore it. It's a structural property that kind of measures the degree of simplicity of a graph. So this, if you can do well parameterized by tree width, that means that you have an algorithm that works well for a fairly large class of simple-looking graphs. You could parameterize by the number of firefighters. Again, this is typically dictated by your budget, and budgets are usually small. So, if you can, if you can come up with a nice algorithm that's, that has a good running time relative to this parameter, probably you're in business. And there have been other parameters that have been considered in the literature. Probably, again, in the interest of time, not get into it as much. It turns out that if you parameterize by the number of critical nodes, again, there's a framework that tells us that you cannot really hope for an algorithm whose running time has this nice form. So we actually have to give up on this parameter in some sense. So that's something that turns out to be a bit of a dead end. Similarly, tree width doesn't really work because in some sense, we've seen that already for trees which have very small tree width, in fact, the tree width of a tree is just 1, already it's hard to cope, even when you restrict your attention to trees. So it's a problem that's already difficult for graphs which are very, very simple. So this, in some sense, is not an ideal choice of parameter. It turns out that if you parameterize by your budget, then things do in fact work out. And, and I think, okay, I'll just say that we also have many other parameters that are studied in the normal firefighting setting when you don't have critical nodes involved. And we'll speak to this a little more towards the end of the discussion when we talk about variance and so on. I'll make this a little more explicit. But now our focus is going to be on parameterizing by the number of firefighters. So let me just talk a little bit about separators and graphs, because hopefully if I get to the point where I can establish that separators are related to the problem of firefighting, I think that would be sort of the goal of this part of the narrative here. So if you have 2 vertices or 2 sets in your graph that you want to separate from each other. So normally, if you think of your graph as a road network, you can probably go from anywhere to anywhere. And now you can imagine, and in fact, I think the historical study of separators does involve applications that came up in war settings where you have 2 locations on either side of some sort of a border. And let's say you want to cut off supplies with the warring nation. So you want to do some damage to ensure that a supply location is not accessible to a provider location is not accessible to somebody who needs those supplies. And again, your war budget is small, so you want to, or at least is something that you have to be careful about, even if it's not small particularly, but you want to probably do the minimum the minimum amount of damage. You want to destroy as few roads as possible to achieve this goal of completely separating these 2 critical locations. So in a graph, more formally, you could just think of a separator as a subset of vertices whose removal disconnects the vertices x and y, which leaves you in a situation where there is no path from x to y. And this is one of the most fundamental sort of problems that has been studied in the context of graphs. There's a lot that has been understood and said about separators of various kinds. And when you remove a separator, the thing that is left behind, the things that you can in fact read from one of these things that you're trying to separate. Okay, so I wanted to talk about why separators are important to people who think about firefighting, because in some sense, you're trying to separate the source of the fire from your critical set. So you have the critical set that you're trying to protect, and then you have the source of the fire, and you can think of the firefighters as standing on a separator to sort of guard the fire from getting to the critical node, starting from wherever the source of the fire is. So again, in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll skip some of these separator variants, and maybe I will just walk you through this little example here. So imagine that the fire starts at the leftmost vertex, and the vertex you're trying to protect is the rightmost one, that's the black one. And you could think about, well, there are many separators here, many ways of separating the leftmost vertex from the rightmost one. And suppose I try to protect the black vertex on the right by placing firefighters on the pink vertices that were lined up closest to the black vertex. It turns out that that's not a very smart thing to do, and your black vertex will actually end up catching fire if you try to do that. On the other hand, if you placed your firefighters along this blue diagonal here, in some sense, you're always one step ahead of the fire, and you just about nail it. So the point is that, yes, we are interested in placing firefighters on separators, but which separator should we work with? That's not completely clear. Not all separators are the same. And you could think about separators as roughly being of 2 sorts: the ones that are close to the source and the ones that are close to the critical nodes. And both of them have their pros and cons. And And it requires a little bit of a balancing act to figure out which separators you should ultimately target. And that's kind of the core technical part of our contribution in trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. As I predicted, I will skip this discussion about trees and just quickly talk about other variants of the problem. There is a spreading version where the protection spreads just the same as the fire does. And it turns out that this is also hard. You might also want to account for thresholds because maybe different vertices have different degrees of robustness and not everybody catches fire immediately, but they need a certain number of neighbors to be on fire for them to catch fire. So that's another variation that people talk about. And then you could combine some of these objectives. You could say you want to minimize the number of firefighters subject to being able to save at least a certain number of vertices and so on. And you could also look at the variant where you allow to deploy multiple firefighters in one round, and you want to minimize how many you deploy per round. And with that, I think, so let me just, yeah, so I think there were a couple of other variants, but I think I could completely skip them at this point and wrap this up here. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for maybe going a little bit over time there, but thank you. Thank you so much.
Neeldhara, that was a delightful talk. Thank you so much. We have a question for you from Navneet Sriram, who asks, how would you determine the number of fighters to send to deal with a radiation leak using mathematical modeling?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I think if you have if you have a radiation leak, I think that is something that can, to some extent, be modeled by this setting. If you can, so I'm assuming that this is a leak that happens in some sort of industrial factory setting, and then the thing that you want to think about is, maybe there's even like a pipe network where the radiation spreads. So again, for models like this to be useful, we need to work with domain experts for them to tell us what's the nature of the spread, what's the, how exact. So we need to understand how exactly the leak is going to spread, because it may not be completely captured by the BFS style of spread that I talked about here. So you may need a slightly more nuanced approach. But once we have that, and once we have an appropriate network that captures the locations of significance, then I think presumably the known algorithms for the firefighting problem can actually be used, I think can be useful in determining the number of firefighters and even a firefighting strategy. So typically in these things, you're kind of racing against time because the leak is going to spread in its own way, and you have constraints on which, who can get to what place at what time. So you have to kind of account for a lot of that. But once you build up an appropriate model, it sounds to me like it would be closely related to what we have just discussed. And I think you can probably take advantage of some of the known algorithms here. Yeah, thank you. I hope that addresses that to some extent.
That was nice. We have a comment for you from G. Bhaskaran, who says, very nice talk and best wishes. And he says, in Madras, we are fighting with water these days.
Right,
So
right.
he wants to convey to you.
Thank
You
you.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was a lovely talk.